Hi everybody, my name is Emma Driscoll. I'm a press officer at the Council of the EU, and prior to that I was in the English translation and editing unit at the European Economic and Social Committee, where I was also for a time the clear writing coordinator. And so recently I've managed to bring these two interests together. In my current role at the press office, I've been involved in an internal project basically to look at how we write our press releases and how we can write them more clearly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, and also a bit about press releases, why we need to write clearly, why there are challenges to writing clearly, and how we can maybe improve the clarity of press releases. So before I start, I just wanted to ask if you could raise your hand if you work with press releases at all as part of your job. So that includes maybe editing or translating, or drafting them or adapting them possibly for local audiences. So about half the room I think I saw. So yeah, so hopefully some of you will be able to answer this first question. So any ideas? What is a press release? How would you define it? If anyone has any? Go ahead.
I would talk about it as a sort of summary of something, and in the particular context in which I work, it's a summary of a key stage in a case. Mm-hmm. So usually the delivery of an important opinion or a judgment or an order, mm-hmm. in a case that's usually of international interest. Oh, sorry.
Oh.
So key stages in a case that's of usually international interest, and we're looking more at a kind of layperson public. We're still tending to stick quite closely to the text, the source text, so the judgment or the order or the opinion, but we want to make it more layperson friendly, so we don't necessarily use the language that we would use in-house. Uh-huh. And it's usually quite tight deadlines, mm-hmm. and we do it in conjunction with our press unit at the court. That's how we do it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's, I think, certainly I think from the institutional perspective, it's often the case that you're reporting on a particular stage in the legislative procedure or a particular event that's happened. So, yeah, no, that's very good. Go ahead.
Just a comment on the target audience, mm-hmm. that the target audience is not necessarily the general public, but journalists. Mm-hmm. So, and I'm not always sure that everyone keeps that in mind, because it makes a big difference. They're laypersons when it comes to the topic, mm-hmm. but they are specialists in, mm-hmm. In their field of the communication.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I'm going to talk a bit about that in the presentation today, because I think that, I think possibly sometimes press releases are aimed at the general public, but I think in a lot of cases we do aim at a specific audience, which is journalists. That's right. I have one more suggestion.
Yeah, sorry, just to reply to that last comment. We find that, in fact, the text of press releases is used by journalists, mm-hmm. for what they publish, which of course goes to the general public. So I'm not sure that I would agree with what you just said.
That's interesting. I think, we can continue this discussion, because I think there's going to be some elements in my presentation that will address that. So, so this is the Oxford English Dictionary definition. It's very, very broad, and I think that in an institutional setting, in the EU institution setting, I think probably we would add a few elements to this definition, but I'm keeping it broad for here. And I think that basically in this definition there were two things that I would pick out. So information on a particular matter. Basically, we don't just publish press releases for the sake of it. We publish it when something specific has happened that we want to communicate about. And we can talk at length about what should go into a press release and what the aim should be, but I've kind of picked out three elements. So basically, you want your press release to inform people about what's happened and why it's important. So what is the news? And then you want them to know what happens next. What is the impact of this news? What are the next steps going to be? And the second element that I would pick up from this definition is issue to newspapers. So I think, I mean, we could talk at length about whether or not press releases should also be aimed at a broader general audience. And if they are aimed at journalists, whether that does mean that we're not sort of thinking about non-experts when we're drafting. And I'll talk a bit about that. But I think, like, at the Council at least, we do have a specific idea of who our audience is. And I will talk about that in just a moment. But just to give you an idea of when the Council publishes press releases. So because the bulk of our work is dealing with legislative files, so as one of the co-legislators with the Parliament, we receive proposals from the Commission, and then in-house, the Member States decide on their position on that proposal, and then they negotiate with the Parliament, and then you have the outcome. So most of our press releases are around this ordinary legislative procedure. So, for example, once the Member States have decided what their position is on a particular file, we would normally release a press release. And then, for example, once we've reached an agreement with the Parliament, we would also issue a press release on that. And then once that final piece of legislation has been adopted at Council level, we would release a press release on that as well. And then, obviously, we release press releases on other things, and it depends on the topic, it depends on the Council formation. But yeah, for example, conclusions, resolutions, Council recommendations. There's a lot of other things around the legislative procedure that we might also communicate on. And so here's the big question that we've already touched upon. Who are we writing for? And I think it is something that's open to debate and will vary from institution to institution, depending on also what kind of journalists are following your topics. I think, for example, the European Central Bank might take a different approach to the Council or to the committees, depending on the topic and the aim of the particular activity. So at the Council, I mean, we're still doing this ongoing project on our press releases and how to make them clearer. And one of the things that we've decided, that we've agreed upon, is that our audience is primarily journalists. But that's still a very big field. But yeah, so we recognize that, for example, other EU officials, other stakeholders like academics, lobbyists, NGOs, and the general public do read our press releases. But basically, that is a very, very broad audience to try and address. So we do really try to keep journalists in mind when we're writing, while also being aware that it's not only journalists that are reading our press releases. So this is just an example of some of the publications that we'll publish on Council activities. So ranging from international media to news agencies like Reuters and Bloomberg, to the kind of the Brussels bubble, the EU affairs specific publications like Euractiv, Politico, Agence Europe, and then you've got national media, and then also the more specialized publications. So one of the topics I cover is agriculture, and so we get sort of specialist agricultural journalists who will ask questions, and they'll publish specifically sort of very detailed reports on those topics. So when you're drafting press releases and also when you're fielding questions from journalists, you do get a very broad range of knowledge and expertise. So, for example, I was covering the negotiations between the Parliament and the Council on the Common Agricultural Policy a couple of years ago, and I had people calling up asking for very detailed information on the progress on specific articles and specific recitals, and very kind of specialized information about like the sort of the width of the sort of the stretch of like sort of grass that was supposed to be between a field and a river and these kinds of things. And then I had people calling up and saying, right, so what is this common agricultural policy? Explain it to me in 3 sentences. So you do, even within the sort of the target audience of journalists, you get different kind of levels of specialization, let's say. And so why do we think it's important to write clear press releases? Well, one of the inspirations that we that sort of prompted us to look at the clarity of our press releases at the Council was this study that came out in 2021 that was looking at Commission press releases across a very long sort of period of time, and found that the level of clarity, you kind of needed a PhD really to be able to read a lot of the press releases. I think this has changed. I think that it was a very long period of time that they were looking at. So, but one of the things that we, that part of my notes. So one of the things that came out of this study, looking at this kind of the broader literature on the clarity of press releases, was that journalists are more likely to cover a story if the press release is written in clear language. So this was based on a study that was carried out at the European Central Bank, published in 2021. Basically, yes. I mean, if a journalist can read and quickly understand a press release, they're more likely to cover that. And this is maybe more relevant for the sort of things where, it might be a judgment call for the journalist whether they're going to publish on a particular topic or not. I mean, sometimes they're going to publish even if the press release is incredibly opaque and difficult to understand because it's a very important topic. But if you want people to write about what you're doing, then it's statistically proven that it's a good idea to write clearly. And this was a quotation from another study that was referred to in this article, from a journalist who said that half of my work is to translate press releases into normal words, which I think perhaps quite often as press officers we rely on journalists to do this. We sort of put down the policy jargon and we expect them to do the work of translating it. And really, journalists have very little time. They may be covering a wide range of topics, and we don't want to add to their work in this way because either, as this shows, they won't publish on this topic, or they will publish, but they might misunderstand it, or they might, as another element of the study showed, they might simply reproduce the language of the press release, because again, they don't have very much time. They may be worried that they're going to misunderstand or misinterpret. And this was another element of this study that basically showed that journalists quite often lift the language of the press release directly from that press release. So it's very important to write clearly because basically if the journalist is using the same jargon that the press officer is using, then that will then go to the citizen who will not necessarily understand what's being said in this article. And so, as a result, citizens who can understand the reporting about EU affairs, they have a better understanding of what's happening in the EU, and they have a better perception of the EU. And this is very important. This is the impact that we want to have. We want to make sure that EU citizens understand what we're doing here in the EU institutions, and we want to make sure that they have the best positive perception, the best possible perception of the work that we're doing. So that's important as well. And this is something that Liutauras is going to talk about in his presentation. So I won't talk about it too much here. But obviously, the clearer our press releases, the less likely it is that the EU's message is going to be misunderstood or willfully distorted, which obviously is a problem in certain areas at the moment. So it's very important to keep that in mind as well. And so then what does it mean to write clearly? So going more into the kind of the clear writing side of things. So one of the things that we did was to look at clear writing principles and try and think of which ones would be most applicable to writing press releases. And I think pretty much all of them are, but we kind of tried to focus on a few. So just to, does anyone know what this refers to? Yes? Exactly, yes, yeah. So keep it short and simple. I've heard other, keep it short and sweet, keep it simple, stupid. There's other variations, but keep it short and simple. Especially, I think, for press releases, we try to aim for 1 page in total. We try to keep the sentences very short. Paragraphs, maximum 2 or 3 sentences. Because also it's a digital product and most people will be reading it online. So you want to have plenty of white space. You want to make sure that the way that it's laid out is simple to follow as well. Active language. I mean, I'm thinking of two things here. I'm thinking of using the active rather than the passive voice. Basically, I think there have been studies that have shown that the passive voice can be quite tiring for the brain. So you don't want to be sending your reader to sleep, basically. You want them to be able to follow and to be engaged with the language. And I'm also thinking about verbs rather than nouns. I think you notice with a lot of EU documents, they're very nominal styles, very kind of like, and it is tiring to read, and I think it does disengage the reader. And if it's true what the study is saying, that journalists will often just take the language for the press release and reproduce it, then you're boring the citizen as well as the journalist. A minimal jargon, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but trying to the extent possible, reduce the amount of jargon in press releases. I think it's sometimes more difficult for more technical topics, but there are ways around it, and it's something we've been exploring at the Council, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. A logical structure, so that journalists, if they're familiar with your press releases, they know exactly where to find what information. So I'm thinking basically the idea of the reverse pyramid, where you've got the most important information set out very clearly at the top, and then moving down to kind of more detailed information for those who need it further down, making sure that you've got a solid headline, leading paragraph, that the text is clearly set out and you know exactly where to find the information. And this is related, using bullet points, subheadings, bold text, so that you can draw the reader through and you can point out to them the most important points, and so that they don't need to go hunting for the information, it's there for them. So just as an example, so this is I'm not going to name and shame, but this is a genuine sentence drafted by a council official in the context of preparing a press release, not a press officer, I'll just say. And I won't necessarily ask you to rewrite it, but can anyone point out what they think might be wrong with this sentence? Like any kind of elements? I think there are a few different ones potentially. Yes, yeah, there's a lot of nouns in there.
Is it the guidance or the conclusions that are on the need to seize opportunities? Like, that's what is not clear.
Yeah.
Sorry, could you repeat?
Yeah, whether it's not clear what the sentence is actually even trying to say, like what. Yes, well, exactly. It's one of those classic situations where the important information is actually right at the end of the sentence, so rather than at the beginning. So, any other kind of thoughts about it? It's very, very, very long indeed. Yes, yeah. I think there's also a certain amount of passive language in there. So I'll give you one attempt of rewriting it. We can talk, there are probably sort of many ways that we can improve it, but this is just one suggestion. So what I've done here is to break the sentence, not just into two sentences, but into two paragraphs. And this, I think, possibly you wouldn't necessarily do with every kind of document, but I think for press releases, because they are, as I said, digital products, so they appear on the website, and the more white space you can have, the better. So that's why I kind of actually divided into two paragraphs here. I tried to put the important information at the start, and I tried to get rid of some of the nouns, turn them into adjectives, pick out the salient points in bold. And like I said, I think it could be, there are ways to improve it further. There's still a certain amount of jargon in there, for example, that might need to be explained. But possibly you could explain that further down in the press release. You can look at other ways of doing that. So, but that's just kind of one example of ways that you can go ahead. Yeah.
Do you know the standard structure for presenting this sort of press release, because the council's including conclusions all the time?
We do, and that's actually something that we've been talking about in our current in the project, to sort of make sure that we're very consistent in the kind of, depending on the kind of news we are communicating, to make sure that we're consistent across the press office in how we set out that information, so that when journalists come to read it, they know exactly where to find the information and they know exactly what's being said. So, yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit more, but we've looked at our structure to make sure that it's consistent across all press releases, so that all press releases will, for example, have the headline, they'll have the lead paragraph, they'll have the quotation, the main body of the text, then we'll have like a next steps, so that you know where you are in the legislative procedure, and then background, and you can put in there any extra information that you think particularly specialists might want to know about. And we've thought also about the terminology and the language that we use when talking about conclusions, for example, or a council mandate, but I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Yes.
Sorry, just to say, if people do ask a question, can you repeat the question back so that we capture it on the streaming?
Of course,
okay.
yeah.
And that's for everybody else who's speaking as
okay,
well, or
yeah,
asking the microphone, okay?
Okay, I will, yes, yeah. Why do press officers not write clearly? I don't know if anyone recognises this quotation. I've only made this letter longer because I've not had the time to make it shorter. It's been attributed to many different people. This particular phrasing I found from Blaise Pascal, from a letter he wrote in 1657. And I think it really does apply when you're pressed for time. Actually, it's a lot harder it takes time to sort of sit and write things clearly, and press officers are under a huge time pressure. I mean, there's a certain amount of preparation you can do in advance if you know that a communication opportunity is coming up, but quite often you find yourself with a very short amount of time to draft something and have it sort of validated by everybody who needs to check it, and then for it to go out. And then, you know, quite often you've got your perfect press release, and then the outcome of the trilogue turns out to be totally different to what you expected, and so then you need to adapt it at 3 o'clock in the morning very, very quickly and send it out to make sure that you get your press release out on time. So I think in that case it's very, very easy just to simply repeat the language of the policy experts, because you know that it's correct. And you can just basically put it down and send it out. It's incredibly tempting. And I must admit, coming from basically training on clear writing to then drafting myself, I really became aware of these challenges, and that even if you've had that kind of training in clear writing, it's very, very difficult when you're pressed for time to always kind of remember those principles and keep them in mind. Exposure to Brussels jargon. So we've talked a little bit about this already. So I think that when you're immersed in that world, it's like with learning any language. You know, the more you're immersed, the more these terms become normal and familiar, and you forget that they're not normal and familiar to other people. So, I mean, yes, like we talk about, the Mertens has come out. You know, who outside the council knows what that means? Possibly people from the other institutions, but I think there's a lot of jargon that gets thrown around, and it becomes so familiar that you forget when you're drafting for an external audience that they might not necessarily understand. So influence from other stakeholders. So like I said, for council press releases, we have a validation process. So the press officer writes the original draft of the press release. It's then sent to... Oh, hang on. Before I do that, I had a funny metaphor that I was just going to share with you. It's a funny thing because I grew up thinking this was a widespread and commonly recognized metaphor, but I'm not totally sure because I've mentioned it to people recently and everyone looked at me blankly. Does anyone know what this is referring to? Exactly. Thank you very much. A camel is a horse designed by a committee. It's a little bit like too many cooks spoil the broth, but I feel like visually, and I mean no offense to camels, obviously camels are designed in exactly the right way they need to be to survive in the desert, but I just love that idea that you've got a committee of experts all, you know, with goodwill, all bringing their own kind of expertise and contributions to a single project, and sometimes that can work well, but quite often when you've got people pulling in different directions, what you end up with is not the horse that you were aiming to design, but something that looks quite different and is maybe not fit for the purpose that you're looking for. So for us, so we draft a press release, we then send it to the policy expert to check, and quite often, I mean, it depends from topic to topic and from team to team, but often it will come back with a lot of changes and a lot of suggestions for language that might be kind of, you know, correct from the policy perspective, but is not very easy to read. And then what often happens is that we'll try and redraft and send it back to them again, but then that takes time. So quite often you end up just kind of trying to incorporate those suggestions in a way that still kind of makes sense. We send it to the head of the press service to basically validate from the communication perspective. So that's generally something that sort of brings a more positive element in, because you're thinking in that case about communicating with journalists and about whether or not it makes sense. Sometimes, depending on the topic, we will send it to the legal service. We try to avoid that. I mean, they're fantastic, but they will quite often come in with incredibly sort of heavy legal jargon, and then once they've been consulted, they kind of try and insist on it. So, you know, if it's not necessary, then we don't necessarily always send it there. English editing, again, usually a very kind of positive contribution. So, but then you're kind of, again, being pulled back and forth. And then the final level is the political validation by the Council Presidency, and that's usually on both sides. So they obviously need to sign off on the quotation, so we will suggest a quotation for the Council Minister. They sometimes come back with their own quotation, and we might sort of suggest changes to that, but ultimately they have the final decision on that. And they will also make suggestions both at the policy level and at the communication level. And generally, you need to have quite a good reason to sort of resist a change that's been made at that level, because it is the political level, so it's very important. So yeah, you have a lot of, I mean, so not only does this take a lot of time, but it also means that you've got a lot of experts designing that horse, which can create issues. So another element that does create challenges is very complex topics. So, for example, at the moment, I cover topics such as agriculture, fisheries, health, labour rights, and these topics can be very complex. And I mean, one good thing is that I'm also not an expert on these topics, so I can kind of bridge, in a way, the complexity of the legislation and the kind of how to communicate that to a wider public, because I'm also asking the same questions that the journalists might well be asking. But again, if you have complex topics combined with time, combined with like the influence from other stakeholders, that does create a very complex text a lot of the time. And then finally, and I think we've touched upon this a lot already, assumptions about the target audience. So like I said, our target audience is journalists, and more specifically journalists covering EU affairs. But I think there can be a tendency sometimes to assume that because a journalist is covering EU affairs, they know everything there is to know about. Oh, okay, I'm near the end. About sort of the Brussels kind of bubble and the Brussels jargon, and it's not always the case. I mean, sometimes you do have journalists coming from those sort of specialist publications or from the very EU-focused publications like Agence Europe, who will know more about your topic than you do. But a lot of the time you are communicating with people who are covering a wide range of topics, and who need that information clearly and more or less in layperson's terms, I think. So still obviously knowing that you're dealing with a professional journalist who's covering these affairs, but also just thinking, you know, like basically trying to sort of not assuming that they're going to know everything that you know about that topic, for example. So basically just thinking about sort of how to this has come out of our project looking at writing clear press releases. So some of the tips that we had, one is basically taking the time to think about your message before you start writing. So I think it reminds me a little bit of the advice that teachers used to give before exams. You know that you only have like 2 hours to write this exam, and you just want to kind of launch in and get it done. But those kind of 5 minutes that you take to really think about it before you start writing, thinking about the structure, thinking about basically what the message is, and what it is you want to communicate and how best to communicate that, can make things a lot faster in the long run, and can also just make sure that it makes a huge difference in terms of your of the communication power of your press release. And then just in general, not necessarily when writing press releases, but just when writing anything, always consciously thinking about the language that you're using. This was something that really came out of the clear writing training that I was involved with before. This idea that basically clear writing is work and it takes constant practice. And so basically whenever you're writing, always trying to think about these principles. You know, am I using too much passive voice? Am I using too many nouns? How long are my sentences? So that when you come to write press releases, when you come to write something where you have a time pressure and you need to be focused, it comes more naturally. So, as I said, don't assume your audience has the same level of expertise as you. And this was something that we did during this project. We read a lot of other press releases both from the council, so we had a peer review service, a peer review system internally where we revised each other's press releases, and then also from other institutions. So we looked at the Commission, we looked at the Parliament, we looked at the European Central Bank, NATO, the UK government, and we looked at what worked and what didn't. And that was a really interesting experience, I think. And we also looked at how journalists had actually reported on our press releases, so what language they'd used. Had they kept the technical terms that we'd used, or had they adapted them? If so, how had they adapted them? What kind of language had they used? Did they pick up our quotes, or did they use a quote from somewhere else? And that was also very interesting, and obviously you see a difference in the kind of publications. So the Financial Times isn't going to report in the same way and with the same language that Euractiv or Politico will use. So that was quite interesting as well. And again, it's time consuming, but I think it can be quite useful. And then finally, just to say some other sort of things that we're doing at the council as a result of this ongoing project. What we were just discussing before, basically we've put together a list of common jargon terms and suggestions for clearer alternatives. And the idea is that we use these systematically. So, for example, if there's been an agreement between the Parliament and the Council at the end of a trilogue, at the end of the negotiations, you'd use the word deal, basically. So, and you try and consistently use the same terms, and so then when the journalist comes and they see, like, you know, Council reaches deal with Parliament on X or Y, they know straight away that this is the end of the trilogues and that basically now we're going to go into the next stage. And the idea is that we will agree on these terms and then try and use them consistently. A consistent familiar structure, so again, what we were saying before, basically trying to always make sure that our press releases follow the same structure so that journalists know exactly where to go to find the information that they need. This is something that we've included that's aimed both at a more general audience and journalists as well, that we try to include any infographics or videos, either that we already have or that we develop specifically for this communication opportunity. So we develop these with our colleagues in the digital editing team and in the audiovisual team. And they explain in a clear and simple way what's important about the topic and what you need to know. And I think especially for a journalist who's new to a particular topic, they've been told, oh, you need to cover this now. You can go to one of these infographics and you can get the basics, and you can kind of have an instant, fairly clear understanding of what's happening. And we try to include links to these in our press releases. And another thing that they do is they make the press releases more accessible to non-journalists, non-experts who might be reading the press release as well. Because, as I was saying, we do have more readers than just our target audience. Likewise, we have policy pages on all topics that the Council deals with, and they're constantly updated. And they're written with a lay audience in mind. So they're aimed at EU citizens, the general public, students, academics. So there's kind of enough information for sort of people with a higher level of expertise, but there's also just like it's very clear, user-friendly, readable explanation of topics. And the final thing that we're planning to do once we finish this project is to start awareness raising among our policy colleagues, because obviously, we have a very good ongoing relationship with our colleagues and with the policy experts, and they're fantastic. And what we really want to try and do is to just explain to them, if we're trying to use clearer language, why we're trying to do it, what our aim is, so that basically we can kind of work together in a way that we can make sure that the most important points come across in the press release in a way that's still intelligible for the reader, for the target audience. So we're kind of looking at how to do that, whether it will be by awareness raising sessions or sharing our guidelines with them, but that's kind of a plan that we have as well. And then just a few takeaways. So we know that EU institutions need to communicate clearly to have impact and to make sure that citizens understand what it is we're doing and why it's important and how it benefits them. However, it is very challenging to write press releases for all the reasons that I've just set out. But there are ways that we can write more clearly. And I think that, the more that we sort of think about this and work on it, the clearer press releases will be at EU level. And I think that was a bit more than 5 minutes, but that's the end of my presentation. So if you want to take a look at the Council's press releases, there's a link up there to our press release page and to our Twitter account that focuses specifically on communication with journalists. Thank you very much for listening.
Hello all, I'm Liutauras Ulevičius. I'm presenting my initial or intermediary research data from our team of researchers in Vilnius University. Of course, last 10 years we are all looking to the east side of our states and of our neighborhood, and we see many problems. The headline of our news portals, of our media we are using every day, the major focus of our attention. There are various research studies which show that usually the headlines are forming our opinions, not the leading paragraphs, not the content itself, but actually the headlines. But to start with, I would like to invite you to give a short response or feedback on the Slido poll. Just keeping in mind Ukraine, something what is happening there. Could you please try to select one option which from your perspective is the best description of what's going on there? The ideas, the text here, the options here are taken from real sources, and we will see how it's developing during the presentation. We will discuss the results afterwards. So I will just move forward. Keeping in mind what's happening, what's a short introduction. But nevertheless, I'll just explain what's happening, or what's the idea behind the campaign of Words Matter of our Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs. It was the problem ascertained that it depends how we call things. It depends what labels do we attach to various structures, and it actually defines our thinking. It defines and creates the future of the initiatives and the discussions we are looking into. But that's the problem. That's the area we're discussing. We at the university collected a team of researchers and did a simple thing. We asked a media monitoring agency to collect all the headlines in Lithuanian media space, online environment, news portals. No social platforms, no papers, no television, no radios. Only online environment, only online media. which is publicly accessible, no enrollment, no paid fees, totally open content. And we used criteria, war, Ukraine, or special operation, which was a different side. You might notice that it's more or less used by the Russian side to define what's happening in Ukraine. So we're checking who uses what, and do we have any outcomes, do we have any trends, just taking the basic, without any initial bias, pro versus cons, etc., etc. To start with, Lithuanian online media per year produces approximately 1.6 million publications. We are a small country, we are a small language user group, so it's quite a small number of publications. In case we took English language, I can't imagine. It will be hundreds of millions of publications per year, I would guess. Nevertheless, total monitored media channels, approximately 265, plus minus it depends because it changes daily actually. And out of total publication of 1.6 million per year, we took, according to the criteria we used, approximately we got 27,000 in case we use the starting point as February 24th, the official start of events in Ukraine. Okay, so that's in case we take the basic data, in case we take initial coverage, these 27,000 publications, and we divide into weeks. We see a clear spike in February, and afterwards it's lowering down. You could ask what's happening in January and February. Why do we have reports about the war, about the special operation before the war started? The answer is there were talks, there were predictions, there were forecasts, somehow, somewhere, etc., etc. Coming further, is it big? Just for a comparison, that's a 3 year period, and you can take the not the strong blue line, but the very blue line underneath it. It's Christmas, mentioning the Christmas, and you will see 3 spikes, small spikes during the course of events. The stronger blue line, it's COVID publications. So you see the initially 2020, there is a huge number of publications. Afterwards, it's lowering down. And the green line is war-related or Ukraine conflict-related publications. So you can see that in the initial stage of the COVID was less that initial state of the war publications, war-related publications. So it was a huge topic in Lithuania. It was a huge topic, I think, in all the countries near the eastern border of the European Union. So we tried to formulate several questions for our research, and of course that's the proliferation of disinformation narratives. It's an information war. And information space, it's not only Russian space, it's not only English space, it's not only Ukrainian space. Lithuanian space is also. Every state, every language space is a place for information war. And disinformation narratives is one of the tools to measure it, tools to navigate. And of course, we asked, maybe we have some characteristics which could be associated with disinformation-related headlines. Maybe other important characteristics we could take out of this database. Of course, we had a task to classify the portals. This one is objective, this one is biased on one side, another one is biased on another side, etc., etc. And the most important part, of course, the recommendations. As I said, we are in the process. With the insights we are presenting are initial. We are in the process of academic validation, which is peer review process. And of course, we have received lots and lots of feedback. It's not enough to make a such strong decision here. We have to add this and this question, etc., etc. But nevertheless, we don't provide answers about the narratives ourselves. We took from the Ukrainian researchers Alexandra Chekhonovska and Lyubov Cybulska, and they say there are 5 major narratives, Russian-originated narratives about the Ukraine. That it's a civil war, that it's Russophobia, that it's Nazism or fascism, that's Ukraine a failed state, Ukraine is a marionette of the West. 5 different stories, and some of these really occur in Lithuanian headlines. You can see, you can pay attention to the red numbers, and although it's rather small percentages, like the highest noticed narrative distribution is 1.4% of publications. So out of 27,000, we have 400 publications, which might be related to the narrative of the Ukraine is a marionette of the West. So, yes, it's part of the data set. It's already fixed. What could be in other language spaces? It's an open question. It's a call for other researchers to look inside. Again, when we look into this distribution of narratives, we see different timelines, and that's the timeline on the monthly scale. And you can see that these major efforts on the disinformation narratives, they were not originating in the beginning of the war, but most interesting, they started to develop, and most evident, they were in September and October, in the fall, autumn of last year. Why? One of our guesses, which is still in the production, in the testing case, we look into the problem at most probably disinformation subjects or the authors of the disinformation activity, they were not prepared for the initial phase of the war. They thought it would have been very quick and successful for their side, but afterwards, when the quick version failed, they started to think what to do. And step by step, they started the distribution of these narratives. Of course, that's a hypothesis. We should check this in other information spheres, in other language areas, but the Lithuanian view is rather clear. So, what insights do we have? That's a relatively small percentage of total publications. Maybe resilience of Lithuanian media. We are working on this issue for 10 years after the Maidan in 2013, 2014. The informational resilience, information and literacy efforts were quite heavy from our government, from our defense ministry, etc. And of course, we even closed down quite a few Kremlin-owned media or Kremlin-related media. It was done via the legal regulation and via official court statements due to the distribution of disinformative material. We closed several broadcasting TV licenses, we closed several portals, etc., etc. So it was quite an example. And of course, recommendations out of this: keep track of the narratives, keep track who is distributing what. In case you see the authors, in case you see the gatekeepers of disinformation, it's much more easier to track them down and to fight back. And of course, you have to educate media. You have to provide answers and provide alert system for the media. Just don't get fooled by some kind of a new narrative. We have several cases when like fake totalist stories about NATO soldiers raping Lithuanian girls in our national state. It was the first case in 2016, afterwards in 2019. Initially it was successful, afterwards it was minimal results from the disinformation distribution point of view. And that was due to the success of our preventative measures in order to prevent offensive actions. Let's go to another insight, another cross-check about the data. You can see again the highest level. It's a weekly report about the total number of publications. Other smaller major war events. It's Mariupol, a fight for the Mariupol Azovstal fortress. It's about the Bucha massacre. It's about Bakhmut. You can see that in the total number of the publications, the mentioning of the major war events are not that high. Sorry? Total. Total. So, what do we have from the insights on the events related? Comparing to the disinformation-related stories, the events-related stories, they are considerably higher. They are the most, it might be up to the 10% of total publications. For example, during the Mariupol stage, when the fight was heavy, yes, quite a considerable number of publications was oriented towards some events happening. And that's the story and the idea for us, to keep track about what's going on, what's on the top line, and we can track to prevent potential disinformation campaigns on that scale, on that area of information. Of course, the problem with the events-related insights is we don't have direct disinformation, because the disinformation is clearly fake stories deliberately distributed towards audience, while fog of war usually covers too much up-to-date stories, because we don't know for sure. When the war is raging in Mariupol, we don't know what's happening inside, because reports are very, very, very seldom, and reports are almost impossible to counter-check or cross-check for the authenticity, for the objectivity. So we have signs of misinformation, but from an academic perspective, we cannot talk about disinformation. We have to be objective for ourselves. We don't know for sure, because the disinformation, what's very important insight, is going from both sides, from all sides in the conflict, and it's very quick trap to get subjectively involved into this discussion. In case you are protecting peace, etc., etc., quickly you can understand that you are also in the process. You yourself might become a member of disinformatory material, and that's a challenging and very, 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 very difficult task for us as a willing people to support peaceful, etc., etc., part of our lives. But in general, the recommendation or the possible solution for that is for such a problem is try to avoid the hostile wording. Whatever you have the content, just stick to the facts. Don't be too emotional. Don't be the judge in the court, but be a reporter, and that's could provide an answer. Okay, so I'm running forward. So the third round for double-checking our insights, it's comparing our war-related war-related data to some baseline peaceful event, and of course the COVID-19 is a good perspective, because during the COVID-19 pandemic we had structurally quite a similar situation. We had a very heavy public debates, public war, who is right, who is false, which idea, which representation of the situation is correct. And of course, we are using the sentiment analysis. We are trying to dig deeper into the content of these publications. But the deeper you get into the forest, the more trees you see around, and the more problems to solve. To have a clear and fulfilling answer, we see that we are on the thin ice sometimes, drawing our recommendations and insights. So, but nevertheless, the role of narratives is very clear. The narratives are the main track record we have to keep eye on. Role of events, be it fake or being true, it's again an essential part. And of course, best practices. From COVID-19, we see lots and lots of documentation made available publicly, free of charge, for everybody to take and use. One of the examples I just took from the World Health Organization. We have a perfect team of researchers in Copenhagen, I think, and they are working on various. They created a term, infodemics, which is slightly populist, but nevertheless, let them go. It's quite catches the problem, because the information we are receiving, we are not quite literal enough, we are not critically sufficient to neglect and be evaluators every time. So, but as I said, this round of comparison to some kind of baseline, comparing the Ukrainian situation, Ukrainian headlines to other stories is in the process, and sorry, but not yet available for the insights. But nevertheless, we have some initial data from first two areas of research, and we see we created 4 different news portals groups, which is the first one is very fact-checking oriented. They are always try to be totally correct. National broadcaster, Lithuanian radio and television, LRT, they are one of these. Sometimes happens, I would say, they are a good-willing media, good-willing journalists, but sometimes they are just too automatic, too mechanical. The best example in this case, we are just trying to translate or something from other sources and just quickly publish. And it sometimes happens that we are just taking something which was created unethically with disinformation resources, and the result is misleading at the best, or even disinformatory at the worst scenarios. And of course, we have quite clear group of Kremlin puppets. There is quite a small number in Lithuania. As I said, we have a quite strong prevention and legal prevention tools, and most of them are directly closed down. But still, we have quite a strong group of intermediaries which are happy to distribute disinformatory material in order to receive quick populist feedback. And that's quite a new problem when we cannot close them down, because they are acting as a free media. They don't have direct ties to Russian finances, such as Sputnik or such as Russia Today. But nevertheless, they are clearly, on the content side, they are clearly oriented towards support the Russian Federation point of view, whatever it is, just copy-paste. So another insight, another point, what could be the characteristics of these disinformation publications? So the first and the most frequent example is a copy-paste. Someone said something, and you are not checking if it is correct, if it is a total lie, if it is direct fake information oriented to mislead. Usually, for example, Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Lavrov, said something. And you can see lots and lots of lie in this citation, but it's copy-pasted and nobody cares. And in fact, we receive disinformation material, which is because the mass audience has no competence, has no tools to compare and to check validity of their statements. And that should be the task for the media, to double-check, to provide alternative source. But due to the automatization, due to the cheap media processes, they don't do that. Loaded language or neuro-lingual programming language is another case when we are just using some formats, labels, stereotypes, which are biased in their essence, just puppet state. when you use puppet state, you cannot prove that you are not puppet state in case you are named puppet state, because just it's already your label, it's already a sign which is provided by someone. As I said, the third problem is no fact-checking efforts. Usually it's the first was the most frequent example, citation, but another one is, as already mentioned, automated translation. And you don't check sources, you don't check the validity of arguments, etc. You just publicize. I'm not sure, but we didn't check this, but the ongoing generative artificial intelligence will make much more evident this is such a problem for a wider scale of disinformation materials. Whatever case, you just would take automated text provided by the chat GPT or whatever else, and you just publish it, while inside there might be a huge number of misleading or disinformatory material. And of course, the automated repetition is kind of similar, but a bit different when you just, again, in case your salary is based on the number of publications you produce, you just copy-paste the basic materials which already were produced 1 month before, but after 1 month period, major factual situation might be totally different. Mariupol has already fallen, or maybe the Kherson Oblast is already retaken. Nevertheless, you just copy-paste. The journalist is quick to publish, and the problem arises. And of course, the general problem of how all the online media is clickbait related, or willing to attract clicks in no matter what information, no matter half-truth or exaggeration which is happening. Okay, so what to do? One of the general or theoretical response to this, try to reframe discourse. Try to clean it, take out stereotypes, take out metaphors, adjectives, traditions, use fact-based basics. Use facts, and it's very difficult to frame facts. Of course, you can say someone is a liberator or someone is a terrorist, totally different perspectives. But when you say that person X killed 10 persons, you cannot reframe that. It's a fact. And of course, no biases. With a huge challenge here, because we as a pro-democracy, pro-peace, pro-rule of law people, we always have biases, because even democracy is a biased environment. Our basic values of democratic society are already biases, and that's a challenge in some cases. But I don't have a simple answer for this difficult question, so I will leave it for you to contemplate later on. And of course, for recommendations for clear writing, it's for the press releases, it's for the social media, whatever else. So narratives, and once more narratives. Pay attention, make a taxonomy, make a categorization, and track record of them. Another interesting insight that too much myth-busting is questionable. In case you are start to produce regular myth-busting materials, sometimes you just raise the publicity of some minor narratives. It's a paradox. But usually, the some minor paradox, they are very slight. As you can see in this headline percentages, some narratives are very low, several publications per year. In some cases, it was 3 or 10 publications per year. In case you publish and put it on the front page of a leading news portal, you make it well known. And somebody will say, okay, oh, what a good idea. Again, they are trying to fix our minds. No, that's the real thing. So be clear, be thoughtful about this idea. When we talk about the events, please mind the words. Words matter, as in this, for foreign affairs, it depends how you name something. We'll look into in practice a bit later. And leave decision to the reader, but at the same time, we have to measure. Not leave too much unanswered questions, not leave citations without fact-checking information. Don't leave one-sided information, not providing an alternative. And of course, process-related, don't copy-paste. Be wary of this, the challenges inside. Citations are always a minefield, and policy decisions is our personal decision, but it's again, neutrality in a war is seldom an option. Okay, so what we see from our poll, Russian invasion of Ukraine is the leading one. Invasion war against Ukraine, Russia's war. So, Russian invasion, okay. Invasion war against Ukraine is a bit, from our perspective, from a research group perspective, is a bit not the best option, because it lowers the importance of Ukraine, or means that Ukraine is somehow not equal to the aggressor. It's somehow lower. It's somehow someone can invade. Someone can bring start a war against Ukraine. When you use two sides, Russian and Ukrainian, in the definition, it's a better, more equal and more objective description. Okay, could you please answer the same question once more? We'll check what we have after the presentation. Maybe some ideas would change. Maybe some decisions would be different. And in fact, I think we can leave it for your answers. We can shift forward and comment on later on. Yeah, good. Thank you.
My name is Giulia, and I'm a press officer for energy at the European Commission Spokesperson Service. So I'll try to bring in a bit in this interesting panel with my colleagues the perspective of the Commission and what we do in terms of clear writing and the production of press materials. And in particular, I would like to focus on my personal experience as a person who joined the Commission last year at the beginning of the energy crisis. So delve a bit into what we did to communicate clearly on that particular crisis context. Before joining the Commission, I was actually a journalist in this field. I was an energy and climate correspondent in Brussels. So basically, I was an avid reader of press materials by the EU institutions. So I was already quite familiar with it. And I'm happy to tell I didn't need a PhD to read them. So that's quite reassuring already. But let's just jump into my presentation. So first of all, I'll give you just some examples of when the Commission publishes a press release. This is a bit different from the Council. Of course, this is related to our different institutional role. We are those proposing legislations, but we also communicate on other things. And one example is, for example, when we struck some kind of agreements or deals on cooperation with third countries. You see the COP27 example there with Egypt. Another example is our role as guardians of the treaties, basically. So we also communicate on infringements. So when we basically, less jargonly, let's say, we take member states to court to check on their transposition and enforcement of EU legislation. The third example is about the EU energy platform. For example, this is a recent policy that we have introduced to achieve joint purchasing of gas together. And so this is a press release that we issued when we had an important policy development. So that's another case when we want to communicate, of course. And the fourth example is something that Emma also mentioned before, and this is the so-called trilogue deals. So this is basically when the European Parliament and the Council agree on a piece of legislation we proposed. So the Commission also wants to have a say, and there we normally just welcome this deal or the provisional agreement that is reached by the co-legislators. But in terms of big communication splash, well, then our big moment is when actually the College of Commissioners adopt new legislation. So this is really when we come up with our so-called press materials packages. So here I tried to summarize and to put on the slide some examples from the past year. As you can see also from the dates, the pace at which we were proposing legislation last year was quite impressive. And this is, of course, because we were operating in a crisis context, and so we were doing a bit the same in terms of communication. So clearly, the Commission, as all the other EU institutions, has a clear need to communicate clearly and to convey certain messages, and I've tried to summarize this need under two big umbrellas. On the one hand, we have an institutional need to be clear and to use communication properly. You will always find in our press products a clear political message, so we will try to explain the context, but also the aims and goals of the policies we are proposing. And so this applies very much in particular to this moment when the Commission adopts new legislation. And the second element that you will always, that we always need to keep in mind as communicators is the need to explain technical details of a given policy. And this is in particular related to our institutional role, because clearly being those proposing legislation, we are the first one making, let's say, people familiar with a certain topic, with a certain policy tool. So we will need to then find a balance between technicalities and easy language to explain to the general public what that means. And final point is the legislative process. Clearly, as I was explaining, we are those basically proposing legislation, but then we also are there as an honest broker in negotiations. And so we always need to make clear in our materials, we always try to make clear in our press releases, and you will find it in the structure of those, the different steps in the adoption process of legislation, etc. And the second umbrella that is basically the element that is at the basis of the need for us to communicate clearly is the target audience. This is something Emma has touched upon before, of course. Let's say that our main clients are journalists, but journalists themselves are an heterogeneous crowd, because you might have Brussels correspondents of big newspapers covering a wide range of topics, and on the other side you may have more Brussels bubble media covering policy areas, so basically specialized reporters. And so we have to make sure that we are able to talk clearly to all of them with our materials. And clearly we also found out, especially we realized during the crisis, that actually our press materials are not only used by journalists, the debate we were starting before, but it's true that sometimes our press materials are the first go-to tools for many actors that follow the policy-making process in the EU. So let's think about trade unions, industry associations, NGOs, so the usual suspects when it comes to the bubble. But not only, because clearly, and we see this very often in the spokesperson service, we also have journalists reaching out to us from the capitals. So those that are less familiar with the EU processes, and we always need to make sure that they can sort of grasp the gist of what we want to say and communicate and do, especially with our policies. So by now you may have noticed that I tend to refer to press materials more broadly and not just press release, because this is exactly what we are trying to do at the Commission. We tend to accompany press releases with other communication products. So in particular, when we have these big packages of legislation proposed by the College, by the Commission, we also produce press packages. And so the first product that we use to accompany press releases is questions and answers. Again, this is because being the first ones proposing a certain legislation, we want to make sure that people understand the objectives and the tools of how we want to achieve something. So this is basically a question and answer is basically a document which is a list of questions. It's quite self-explanatory, with replies. This can be 2-3 pages, so a little bit longer than a usual press release. That tends to be 1 or 2 pages max normally. And the second product that we produce to, let's say, accompany press releases are fact sheets. So this is a bit more of a visual product, so to say. It's normally in PDF format, and this is basically published at the bottom of our press releases after the question and answers. And the goal here, of course, is to help people visualize a bit more concretely and with the shorter sentences, the main messages and the main objectives of some of our proposals. Of course, it's quite convenient also to then use graphs, pictures and visuals to help people really picture in their mind what we try to do with policies that sometimes, especially in my field, in the energy and climate action field as well, are quite technical. So I was just wondering if perhaps you are already familiar with this sort of communication products, if you use them in your job, or if this sounds completely Arabic to you. So if you could, perhaps the people in the room can perhaps just raise their hand, and those online can just yeah. So okay. So I'm not bringing you to something completely new, but it's good that maybe for some people it is. So yeah, what I wanted to address is clearly the added value that we see in these communication products supporting press releases. So the first is, I think, information distribution. And this means that we don't really have to overburden all the information in the press release. You can just distribute it, for example, with a visual in a fact sheet, but also get into the details of a certain policy in the Q&A. And visualization, it goes without saying, this is a crucial added value of fact sheet that we see. And the result is that we also make information more accessible, not just to journalists, because those knowing how we operate, they will already know where to find the information, but also more accessible to the general public. A fact sheet is quite an easy to read product with images, so that helps also making technical things a bit more concrete to them. And final point is anticipation. This is perhaps a bit more interesting for really communicators and people like us being press officers. A question and answer document really helps us anticipate what journalists will ask and have basically the correct language already ready to reply to their questions. So it will actually save us a lot of time after the proposal and help them report more quickly on the details as well, because all the information at hand will be there. And so thinking about a bit about the process and how we produce these press materials, I tried to summarize in 3 bullet points really what I think is key for us when drafting and when producing these materials. And the first is really where for a moment someone else is at, and really ask ourselves questions like a journalist, so we can really anticipate not only what they will ask, but what they need to report our policies correctly and factually also in their work. So we really try to structure the question and answers in a way that anticipates what they are interested in, and the same for our press release. As Emma was saying, also in the Commission, basically we tend to have a typical structure, not really a template, but you will see that we also have at the bottom the famous next steps and background sections, where you really explain the process and where this policy decision stems from. The second step is obviously reply as a policy officer, and this means that when we are drafting these materials, so not just the press release, but the questions and answers in particular, we need to be as accurate and precise as possible. And for that, of course, part of the process is consulting the policy experts, working on the legislation, and the final step is then really for us, the communication specialists, so to say, to rewrite this in a way that is accessible to the public and to journalists, always keeping in mind that those are our main customers, I would say. And the final step, which is crucial for us, is also the translation of all these products in all EU official languages. This is the key point of our cooperation with DGT, and not only, but it's crucial for us to be able to reach out to as much people as possible also in the member states, and to also help journalists, especially online ones, that have to be super fast in grasping the gist indeed of our proposals, and allow them to report them in their native language as well, or in other languages that they are working languages for them, of course. But so now let's just move to the final part, perhaps, of the presentation, which is the part that is really related to the lessons, like I would say, that we learned over the past year when communicating about a really critical and crisis situation. So I will explain to you a bit the challenges, let's say, that we faced as communicators, because we basically found ourselves communicating about technical issues in a time of crisis. And so the first thing that we faced was this, of course, increased political sensitivity to the energy matter. This means that energy policy before the crisis that was triggered by Russia's war in Ukraine was more all focused on the clean energy transition, and so you would have mostly specialized reporters following it. Security of supply was not really in fashion anymore, but all of a sudden we found ourselves in a completely different situation that also caused a big change in the target audience, meaning that you would have generalists started covering energy and that had no previous preparation on it, on how the energy market works, on what are the potential measures the Commission could get. So we really had to go back to the basics to be able to reach out to many people as possible. And third point, of course, in a normal, in a crisis and non-normal context, you would see the time pressure on you as a communicator increase a lot. This was the case for us, of course, in the spokesperson service, and not only. The Council probably experienced the same, I'm sure. We would have emergency meetings and journalists wanting to know what happened there, but also really emergency legislation being proposed and drafted in a matter of days. And this would, of course, reduce the time that we had at our disposal to draft materials. So that was a challenge. But it was also an important moment for us to understand the importance, actually, of communicating and writing clearly, because obviously well-written press materials, as we were saying before, become a key asset for the EU institutions to then send reassuring messages to citizens and to be clear on what they can and actually cannot do. So looking a bit at the strategies that we adopted, setting the right tone was key for us. And the main principles are really here were to give reassuring messages, and make sure that as an EU institution we were showing proactiveness, and we wanted to show really to citizens and companies that were really struggling to pay their energy bills, so that were afraid of remaining without electricity or gas supply, that we were acting. But also, final point, remain realistic is also one of our takeaways. Otherwise, you risk overselling what you can do as a new institution, and then if you create this mismatch of expectations and what you can actually do, it can be dangerous for you actually as a policy maker and not just as a communicator in itself. So here I've tried to look at some examples that are basically the linguistic means by which we tried to do what I was explaining before, so this tone setting strategy that we had. So, for example, we always used the general principles of clear writing, so the active form of verbs, the use of modal verbs to help us give different nuances on the possibilities that you have. So you have, for example, here, can and should take measures, also ways to encourage people to act. This was something we communicated several times. And always use this tone, which is quite reassuring to send a message that is balanced to the citizens, and at the same time, as you can see in the example on the right side, also being quite clear on the risks that we were facing. So we did not basically shy away in this context from telling citizens and companies what we could expect. So again, short and clear sentences, modal verbs to be used with quite attention, the repetition of certain terms like acting as a union, unity, and also some more negative ones on the description of who was causing basically the hardships and the disruptions in the market that the EU and not only was facing. So to summarize a bit the linguistics, so to say, tools we used, basically we, as the Commission, you will see that our materials still have a certain level of technicality in it. This is clearly related to the institutional role that we have and that I was explaining before. But what we try to do then, and this is basically the beauty of our work as communicators, is really to try and explain with easier words, with periphrases, for example, and easier terms, technicalities. And I will give you a couple of examples later. The second thing that we can do is obviously provide examples and make sure that we describe certain policies and situations as real-life ones. And finally, the fact that we need to keep contextualizing and explain processes for non-experts is also something we had to keep in mind precisely because of this change in the target audience, in particular, that we had last year during the crisis. So if we look together at this example on how to translate in easier terms a technical term, I've chosen the market correction mechanism and our press release from November last year, because this was a highly politically debated measure that we then decided to propose. Probably market correction mechanism doesn't really ring a bell, but if I say gas price cap, perhaps it will in many of you if someone followed the regulatory, so to say, debate last year. But on the right side, again, you can see some examples of how we tried to render this term in easier words. So you can find a different level of details in crescendo in this case. So we called it also a safety ceiling on gas prices, also with this safety message to provide a bit of a reassuring tone on the role of this policy. And then the more you get into the details, you have the first two examples are actually from the press release, whereas the last one it's from the Q&A. So also we see here how a different communication product allows us to get into a different level of details when communicating on a certain tool. The second example, this is another temporary emergency measure that we introduced last year, and this is the revenue cap on inframarginal electricity producers. As such, it sounds like something quite monstrous and difficult to understand, but here in the red sentence you can find actually an easier explanation that is perhaps more digestible also for non-experts, or still for experts that in any way need to explain this technicality to a general audience and public. Another strategy that I was mentioning before is, of course, the one of giving examples. This is a short passage in our questions and answers on the recent reform of the electricity market that we proposed. So a bit less of an emergency tool in the context of the crisis, but a long-term measure that we have recently proposed. And here we really try to give a real-life situation example and the impact that our policy may give. So, of course, here the concept is energy sharing and the idea of introducing an energy community, but there, with this sentence, we simply tried to explain what this can mean in the real world. So, tenants, for example, being able to access rooftop solar energy produced from the neighbors. This is something that everybody can relate to. And this is my final example, and this is more about the importance of the contextualization of the policy choice and how you can do this via language. Again, you will see that here we also tried to explain difficult and quite technical developments in the energy market, but also there we tried to stick to the principles of clear writing, so using short sentences, providing data, using numbers, dates, and then always give, as you can see in the red part, a reassuring message and a clear meaning to what we were trying to achieve there. So actually this leads to the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions if you have, of course, and these are my contacts in case you want to keep in touch after today's conference, and thanks for your attention.